The year 1532. November 16th, the Peruvian Andes, in the heart of a continent that Europeans called the New World, in a valley nearly 3,000 meters high, lay the city of Cajamarca. The thin, cold mountain air seemed frozen in anticipation. The vast main square bathed in the pre-sunset sun was devoid of a single soul. It was empty, like a stage before the beginning of a tragedy of universal scale. Only in the low stone buildings surrounding it lurked something that did not belong to this world, something alien and mortally dangerous. There in the oppressive ringing swints waited 168 men, 168 arrivals from another world, dressed in dully gleaming steel, smelling of sweat, fear, and iron. They were Spaniards, the remnants of a detachment that, guided by blind faith and an insatiable thirst for gold, had done the unthinkable by invading the very heart of a giant unknown empire. Their leader, an old, illiterate, and ruthless soldier from Spanish Extremadura, stood and watched the road leading down from the mountains. His name was Francisco Pizarro. He was well over 50. Most of his life had been spent in obscurity, hardship, and a brutal struggle for survival in the most hellish corners of the New World. But today, he had gambled everything. He had lured a god, the living god of this world, into a trap. Towards him, accompanied by a retinue of many thousands, moved the Inca Atahualpa, the son of the sun, absolute ruler of Tawantinsuyu, the empire of the Four Quarters, the greatest state ever created in pre-Columbian America. The air filled with a drone, at first quiet like the buzzing of a distant beehive, then growing like the roar of an approaching avalanche. The head of the procession appeared. Thousands of warriors in bright tunics with spears cleared the way. Behind them came courtiers in robes of the finest vicuña wool, adorned with shimmering mosaics of tropical bird feathers. And finally, on a golden litter, gleaming so brightly it blinded the eyes, high above the heads of his subjects sat Atahualpa himself. The Spaniards, clutching arquebuses and the hilts of their swords in sweaty hands, watched this splendor from the cracks in the walls with a mixture of superstitious terror and greedy delight. There were fewer than 200 of them. The Incas numbered in the tens of thousands. Any logical calculation, any military doctrine of the time said that this was pure suicide. But they had what this mighty civilization did not. They had steel capable of cutting through any fabric and skin. They had gunpowder spewing fire and death from a distance. They had horses, monstrous creatures unseen in this world that turned a rider into an armored centaur. And they had a desperate, transcendent audacity, born of centuries of war, poverty, and a fanatical belief in their own destiny. No one yet knew that in a few hours the living god would become a prisoner, and a handful of adventurers, the masters of an empire. This was the point of no return, a moment when history, holding its breath, took its most cruel and incredible turn. To understand how this became possible, we must go back half a century, to a dusty, sun-scorched corner of Spain, where a boy grew up in poverty and obscurity, destined to destroy one of the greatest civilizations in human history. To understand Francisco Pizarro, one must understand the land that produced him. He was born in Extremadura. The very name translates to extremely harsh, and this was no poetic exaggeration. Located in western Spain on the border with Portugal, Extremadura was and remains a land of extremes. Vast plains, scorched by the summer sun, where the powerful guild of shepherds drove their flocks, leaving barren land behind, gave way to the rugged, rocky mountains of the Sierra de Guadalupe. It was a poor, sparsely populated land, a land of stones, dust, and eternal, insatiable hunger, where harvests were meager and the life of peasants was bleak. But Extremadura was not only a land of poverty, it was a land of warriors. For nearly 8 centuries, all of Spain had been the arena of the Reconquista, a holy war to reconquer lands from Muslim rulers, the Moors. And Extremadura as a border region was at the very heart of this war. Here life was cheap, and glory won by the sword was valued above all else. Here, over centuries, a special class of people formed, the Hidalgos. These were minor nobles whose only craft was war. They could be as poor as church mice. Their estates might consist of a single dilapidated tower and a patch of rocky ground. But they possessed immense pride, a heightened sense of honor known as honra, and a profound contempt for any physical labor other than warfare. Their motto was God, glory, and gold, and the order of these priorities often changed depending on the circumstances. By the end of the 15th century, the Reconquista was over. In 1492, after a long siege, the last Moorish stronghold, the Emirate of Granada, fell. And in the same year, another event occurred that opened new, unprecedented horizons for these men. Christopher Columbus, returning from his voyage, announced the discovery of a western route to the Indies. For thousands of unemployed warriors, hidalgos, and commoners, raised on the ideals of the Reconquista, this was divine providence. The war had ended at home, but it was beginning across the ocean. The New World became for them a new Granada, a place where they could continue the holy war against the infidels, who were now the pagans, gain the glory they dreamed of, and most importantly, get rich in a way that was impossible in their poor, war-torn country. From the harsh stones of Extremadura came the most famous and most brutal conquistadors: Hernán Cortés, the conqueror of Mexico; Hernando de Soto, the explorer of the Mississippi; Vasco Núñez de Balboa, the discoverer of the Pacific Ocean; and Francisco Pizarro. He was born in the town of Trujillo around 1475, and his origins were even lower than those of most of his fellow conquistadors from Extremadura. He was illegitimate. His father was Gonzalo Pizarro Rodriguez de Aguilar, nicknamed the Roman, an infantry captain, a veteran of wars in Italy and Navarre, a well-known man, but not wealthy. His mother was Francisca Gonzalez, a simple girl from a peasant family, a servant in a convent. Their liaison was fleeting. The father never officially recognized his son and gave him no education. Legend has it that the infant Francisco was abandoned at a local church and was suckled by a sow. Francisco Pizarro grew up in absolute poverty. He could neither read nor write and never learned to do so for the rest of his life, signing official documents with a special ornate flourish placed between his first and last names, written by a secretary. According to tradition, in his childhood, his only occupation was herding pigs. This detail, possibly invented by his enemies to humiliate him, perfectly reflects his social standing. He was a nobody, a bastard, a swineherd, a man with no future and no hope in the rigid class system of 15th century Spain. In his veins flowed the blood of a warrior hidalgo, but the law gave him no rights to an inheritance or even to a surname. What was going on in the soul of this young man? What dreams and grievances fueled him? We can only guess. He saw around him veterans who had returned from Italy, boasting of their exploits and their booty. He heard incredible, blood-stirring stories about the New World, about lands where gold lay right underfoot, where any brave man could become a ruler. And he made his choice. He had nothing to lose. In Spain, only bleak poverty and humiliation awaited him. His only capital was his physical strength, his endurance, the warrior blood inherited from his father, and a boundless, desperate ambition fueled by resentment of his origins. In the 1490s, still a very young man, he, like his father, went to Italy as a soldier, where Spain was waging long wars with France for control of Naples. There, in the crucible of the Italian campaigns, he passed through his first school of war. He learned to fight in the ranks of the famous Spanish infantry, the tercio, and learned the value of discipline, cunning, and cruelty. But true glory and wealth awaited him not in Europe. Around 1502, at the age of about 27, he boarded a ship bound for the West Indies as part of the flotilla of the new governor of Hispaniola, Nicolás de Ovando. He left his homeland forever, never to see it again. He sailed towards his destiny into a world that would become for him both the stage of his greatest triumph and the place of his ignominious death. Arriving in the New World, Pizarro entered a living hell. Hispaniola, the island where Haiti and the Dominican Republic are located today, was a place of indescribable cruelty and chaos. The gold deposits, which had at first seemed inexhaustible, were quickly depleted. The local indigenous population was dying out at a terrifying rate from European diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, to which they had no immunity, from unbearable labor on plantations and in mines under the encomienda system, and from direct slaughter. The Spanish colonists, disappointed in their expectations of easy riches, fought among themselves for land and slaves, staging mutinies and conspiracies. In this brutal environment, Pizarro spent his first years. He was not a leader. He was an ordinary soldier, one of many. Silent, tall, physically strong, resilient, and obedient, he participated in punitive expeditions against the Indians, received his share of the booty, a few slaves, and a small plot of land with its attached Indians. He learned to survive. He saw how quickly the weak, the careless, or the overly scrupulous perished. He learned to trust no one, to be cruel when necessary, and to patiently bide his time. His first major test was the expedition of Alonso de Ojeda in 1509. Ojeda's goal was the colonization of the coast of modern-day Colombia. This expedition turned into a complete disaster. The local tribes of the Caribbean coast proved to be fierce warriors possessing poisoned arrows tipped with curare. Any scratch from such an arrow meant an agonizing death in convulsions. The Spaniards died by the dozens from wounds, hunger, and disease in the impassable jungles. Ojeda himself was wounded and had to return to Hispaniola for help, leaving Pizarro in command of a handful of survivors in a hastily built fort, San Sebastián. He ordered Pizarro to hold out for 50 days. These 50 days turned into an endless nightmare. Every day someone died. In the end, when almost no one was left of the detachment, Pizarro and the surviving colonists boarded 2 small brigantines and set out to sea, abandoning the cursed place to its fate. But it was on this failed expedition that fate brought him together with the man who would become his teacher and pave his way to glory. This man was Vasco Núñez de Balboa. Balboa, hiding from creditors, had secretly boarded one of the ships sent to help Ojeda. When the expedition was on the brink of ruin, it was he who, thanks to his intelligence, charisma, and experience, took command. He proposed moving to the other side of the Gulf of Urabá, to the lands of the Isthmus of Panama, where the Indians, according to his information, did not use poisoned arrows. There in 1510, they founded the first permanent city on the American continent, Santa Maria la Antigua del Darién. Balboa became the de facto ruler of the new colony. And Francisco Pizarro became his right-hand man, his most loyal and reliable captain. Under Balboa's leadership, Pizarro went through his main school. Balboa, unlike many other conquistadors, preferred to negotiate with Indian chiefs rather than exterminate them. He made alliances with them, married their daughters, exchanged trinkets for gold, and most importantly, listened carefully to their stories. It was from the Indians that Balboa heard the legend of another sea and of a fabulously rich kingdom on its shores, where gold was used to make ordinary utensils. This legend captured his imagination. In 1513, he assembled a detachment of 190 Spaniards, among whom, of course, was Pizarro and several hundred Indian porters, and set out on one of the most famous expeditions in history. They hacked their way through the impassable jungles of the Isthmus of Panama, fought hostile tribes, and suffered from fever and hunger. And finally, on September 25th, 1513, having climbed to the top of a mountain, Balboa saw before him a vast, sparkling expanse of water. It was the Pacific Ocean, which he named the South Sea. Pizarro was one of the first Europeans to see it. This moment was a turning point. Now the path to the legendary Golden Kingdom in the south, which the Indians called Biru or Peru, seemed open, but Balboa's triumph was short-lived. While he was making his great discoveries, his enemies in Spain were plotting against him. A new governor, an old and envious aristocrat named Pedrarias Davila, was sent to Darien. A conflict immediately broke out between him and Balboa. For several years they coexisted in a state of cold war. But in 1519, Pedrarias decided to strike. He accused Balboa of treason and conspiracy. And the man who, by his order, arrested his former commander and friend was Francisco Pizarro. Why did he do it? Was it a betrayal? From the point of view of loyalty, undoubtedly, but from the point of view of survival in the world of conquistadors, it was a pragmatic move. Pizarro understood that Balboa was doomed. Pedrarias was the legitimate representative of the crown. Pizarro chose the winning side. He could not afford sentimentality. Balboa was condemned and beheaded, and Pizarro received his reward. He became one of the most respected and wealthy colonists in the new capital, Panama, founded by Pedrarias on the Pacific coast. By the early 1520s, Francisco Pizarro was already in his late 40s. He had achieved everything a rootless swineherd from Extremadura could dream of. He was the alcalde or mayor of Panama. He had a large encomienda, slaves and livestock. He was a rich and respected man. For most people, this would have been the pinnacle of a life's journey. But not for Pizarro. He had heard of the incredible success of Hernán Cortés, who with a handful of men had conquered the vast and fabulously rich Aztec Empire in Mexico. And he remembered the Indian stories of another sea and a golden kingdom to the south. The dream of Biru would not let him go. The quiet life of a wealthy colonist was not the end for him, but only the beginning, a launching pad for the last, greatest, and most insane enterprise of his life. It seemed the world was frozen in a fragile balance. Panama, founded on the Pacific coast, had become a gateway to a new, unexplored world. But beyond these gates lay only an endless expanse of ocean and impenetrable jungles to the south, teeming with hostile tribes. Rumors of a golden empire of Biru stirred the imagination, but no one dared to set out in search of it. Several small expeditions sent south had returned with nothing, or had perished. The way seemed impassable. It was in this atmosphere of stagnation and unfulfilled hopes that one of the strangest and most fateful alliances in history was born. 3 men, no longer young, with neither nobility nor the crown's support, decided to pool their modest fortunes and stake their lives on a ghostly dream. Their enterprise in Panama was called the Company of the Levant, but behind their backs it was known as the Company of Madmen. The first of them was Francisco Pizarro. He was the brains and the sword of the enterprise. He was about 50. He possessed vast experience of survival in the jungles, an unyielding will, and a reputation as a man who never retreats. He could not speak eloquently, but his silent determination inspired confidence. He was to lead the expedition. The second was Diego de Almagro. He was Pizarro's age and, like him, illegitimate, a foundling from the town of Almagro. He was the complete opposite of his partner. Hot-tempered, outspoken, generous, and open, he was the life of the party. He was an excellent organizer and recruiter. His task was to equip the ships, hire men, and deliver reinforcements and provisions from Panama. He was no less brave than Pizarro, but more impulsive. In one of the skirmishes with the Indians, he lost an eye, which only added to his sternness. Despite constant quarrels, he and Pizarro were bound by a strange, rough friendship of two old soldiers who had been through fire and water together. The third, and perhaps the most important in the initial stage, was Hernando de Luque. He was a priest and a vicar in Panama. Unlike his soldier partners, he was an educated and calculating man. He had no intention of going into the jungles himself. His role was financial. He was a front man, behind whom most likely stood the wealthy licentiate Gaspar de Espinosa, a judge and merchant who did not want to risk his name in such a dubious enterprise. De Luque provided the main capital, handled all the accounting, and used his influence to obtain the necessary permits from Governor Pedrarias. On March 10th, 1526, before the start of the second expedition, this triple alliance was sealed with an official contract and a solemn mass. The partners swore on the Bible to divide equally all the lands, treasures, and slaves they managed to capture. They broke the host, the consecrated bread, into 3 parts, and each ate his own, sealing the contract with Holy Communion. This was an act of deep symbolism. A sacred sacrament was put at the service of the most shameless plunder. Governor Pedrarias Davila gave his permission for the expedition, but not without difficulty. He despised Pizarro and Almagro and did not believe in the success of their enterprise. He agreed only after being promised a significant share of the future booty, which he later sold for the symbolic sum of 1,000 pesos, once again proving his disbelief in the venture. Thus, 3 old adventurers, having pooled their savings, with which they bought 2 old battered ships and equipped about 100 scoundrels and failures like themselves, set off to conquer an empire whose existence they knew only from vague rumors. All of Panama laughed at them. They were considered old men who had lost their minds, trading their well-being for certain death in the jungles. No one could have imagined that these madmen would return as masters of untold treasures and rulers of millions of people. If there is an example in human history of almost supernatural perseverance, it is Pizarro's first 2 expeditions. This was not a heroic epic, but a slow, agonizing descent into hell. The first expedition, which set sail from Panama in November of 1524, was a continuous series of disasters. About 100 men on a single ship moved south along the coast of modern-day Colombia, but instead of golden cities, they found only impassable mangrove swamps teeming with snakes and mosquitoes. The rainy season began. The sky and the ocean merged into a solid gray veil. Food quickly ran out. The men ate shellfish, seaweed, and bitter palm hearts. Civilization seemed to have vanished. They were alone in this primitive, hostile world. One chronicler wrote that the hunger was so great that they even ate the leather parts of their gear. They went ashore but found only empty, abandoned villages. The Indians, having learned from bitter experience, retreated deep into the jungles, taking all their supplies with them. The Spaniards died one after another from hunger and disease. In one of the skirmishes with the Indians at a place they called Burned Village, they were ambushed. Several men were killed, and Pizarro himself received 7 wounds. Meanwhile, Almagro, following him on the second ship, went through the same deadly route. In one battle, an arrow put out his eye. In the end, the 2 battered detachments met. They had lost more than 1/3 of their men and had found nothing but a few cheap gold trinkets. Anyone else in their place would have turned back and forever forgotten about the cursed Peru. But not Pizarro and Almagro. This failure only strengthened their resolve. Returning to Panama, they were met with ridicule and contempt, but they managed, by selling all their property and going into huge debt, to organize a second expedition. This time, in 1526, they gathered about 160 men in 2 ships, hiring an experienced pilot, Bartolomé Ruiz. The second expedition began as horribly as the first: hunger, disease, skirmishes with the Indians. But this time luck was with them. The pilot Ruiz, sent on reconnaissance to the south, crossed the equator and, in the open sea, encountered something that made his heart beat faster. It was a large balsa wood raft with a sail. On it were merchants from the city of Tumbes, and their goods amazed the Spaniards. These were not crude artifacts, but the finest fabrics of vicuña wool, adorned with skillful patterns, pottery, and most importantly, scales for weighing precious metals, as well as many items of gold and silver. The Indians told Ruiz about their powerful ruler, about large cities in the mountains, about temples covered in gold. This was the first real proof of the existence of a great civilization. The dream was taking on flesh. Encouraged by this discovery, Pizarro led his men further south, but again only suffering awaited them. In one raid they captured a village where they found some gold and food, but the Indians constantly attacked them. The men were exhausted and on the verge of mutiny. Almagro once again went to Panama for reinforcements, while Pizarro and the remaining men landed on a small, deserted island they named Isla del Gallo, or Rooster Island. What happened next became a legend. The new governor of Panama, Pedro de los Rios, learning of the expedition's pitiful state, forbade the recruitment of new men and sent a ship under the command of Juan Tafur, with orders to bring back all survivors. When Tafur arrived at the island, the exhausted, ragged conquistadors, seeing him as their salvation, rushed to the ship. At this critical moment, when his entire enterprise was on the brink of collapse, Francisco Pizarro performed an act that immortalized his name. He took his sword and drew a line in the sand. Then he addressed his men, saying that on one side to the south lay labor, hunger, nakedness, torrential rains, deprivation, and death. And on the other, to the north towards Panama, lay rest and poverty. He offered every good Castilian to choose what befitted him more, for to the south was Peru and its riches, and to the north Panama and its swamps. Having said this, he was the first to cross the line. Behind him, one by one, followed 12 more men, the 12 most loyal, most desperate. They went down in history as the famous 13. The rest boarded Tafur's ship and returned to Panama. Pizarro and his 13 comrades were left alone on a deserted island. They spent 7 agonizing months there, feeding on crabs and shellfish, suffering from tropical downpours and insects. It was the ultimate test of their will. Finally, their partners in Panama, Almagro and de Luque, managed to persuade the governor to send a ship for them, but with one condition. They had to return within 6 months with or without proof. Upon receiving this ship, Pizarro and his men, instead of returning, sailed further south, and they were rewarded. They reached the Gulf of Guayaquil and saw a large, well-built city, Tumbes. They saw temples, a fortress, a system of aqueducts. They saw llamas which they mistook for small camels. They saw people dressed in bright clothes and many gold and silver ornaments. The Indians met them with surprise but without hostility. The dream had become reality. The Inca Empire existed. Having gathered irrefutable proof, samples of fabrics, pottery, a few llamas, and a couple of Indian youths to be trained as interpreters, Pizarro turned back. 3 years after the start of the second expedition, he returned to Panama. But not as a failure, but as a triumphator, as a man who had found the fabulous El Dorado. Returning to Panama, Pizarro expected to be greeted as a hero. But Governor Pedro de los Rios remained cold. He did not believe the stories of a great empire, considered them exaggerations, and flatly refused to give permission for a new, third expedition, which would require not hundreds but thousands of men and vast resources. He stated that he was not going to send men to a slaughterhouse for such a dubious enterprise. Pizarro, Almagro, and de Luque were at a dead end. They had spent all their money, gone into debt, lost dozens of men, and found a fabulous country but could not reach it, and so they made the only right decision. If the local authorities hindered them, they had to appeal to the supreme authority. Pizarro was to go to Spain, appear before Emperor Charles V himself, and obtain a royal license to conquer Peru. This was a risky move. Pizarro was an illiterate soldier. He could not speak elegantly and did not know court customs. His partners, especially Almagro, feared that he, upon reaching the court, would forget their interests and take everything for himself. Pizarro fervently swore that he would honestly represent their common interests. In the spring of 1528, taking with him a few llamas, samples of Indian crafts, and several Indians, Pizarro set sail for Spain. His arrival caused a sensation. The bearded, weathered conquistador, who presented strange, sheep-like animals and evidence of an unknown civilization to the court, was received by the young Emperor Charles V. Charles, who always needed money for his endless European wars against France, the Ottoman Empire, and the Protestant princes of Germany, listened with great interest to Pizarro's stories. He had just recently seen the immense treasures sent by Cortés from Mexico, and the story of a new, even richer empire fell on fertile ground. However, the bureaucratic machine of Spain worked slowly. Pizarro spent more than a year at court, knocking on doors, proving convincing. Here, his meeting with his distant relative, the already famous Hernán Cortés, who was also at court at the time, helped him greatly. Cortés, who had just received the title of Marquis, gave him valuable advice, recommending not to trust the secretaries but to appeal directly to the king, and to ask for everything for himself, because if you don't ask, you get nothing. Finally, on July 26, 1529, in Toledo, Queen Isabella of Portugal, ruling in Charles V's absence, signed a document that determined the fate of Peru and the conquistadors themselves. This document went down in history as the Capitulation of Toledo. It was a royal charter giving Pizarro the right to conquer and govern the newly discovered lands. It was in this document, drawn up at Pizarro's dictation, that the seeds of future tragedy were sown. Pizarro, forgetting his oaths, took care of himself first and foremost. According to the capitulation, Francisco Pizarro was appointed governor for life, captain general, adelantado, and chief constable of all the lands he would conquer, with a huge annual salary. He received practically unlimited power. Diego de Almagro, his faithful partner, received only the position of commandant of the fortress of Tumbes, half the salary, and the noble title of Hidalgo. This was an unheard-of insult and humiliation. Hernando de Luque was appointed Bishop of Tumbes and received the post of Protector of the Indians. This was an honorable but purely spiritual post. The pilot Bartolomé Ruiz received the title of Chief Pilot of the South Sea, and the famous 13 from the Isla del Gallo received nobility and other privileges. When Almagro later learned of these terms, he was furious. He accused Pizarro of betrayal, and their friendship developed a deep crack that would eventually turn into a bloody chasm. Pizarro tried to justify himself, blaming the royal officials, but it was too late. Having received the royal license, Pizarro went to his hometown of Trujillo. Now he was not an obscure bastard, but Don Francisco, governor and captain general. He returned a triumphator, and here he gathered his main asset, his brothers. They were Hernando Pizarro, his father's only legitimate son, an educated, arrogant, and cruel man, and his half-brothers on his father's side, Juan and Gonzalo Pizarro, young, brave, and reckless warriors. Together with another half-brother on his mother's side, Francisco Martín de Alcántara, they formed the core of his new army, the Pizarro clan, which would rule Peru with an iron fist. In early 1530, having assembled a small detachment and 3 ships, Francisco Pizarro and his brothers set sail from Spain. They were not sailing into the unknown as before. They were sailing to conquer their empire. Returning to Panama, Pizarro faced Almagro's wrath. Only with great difficulty, by promising him an equal share in the post of adelantado in the future, did he manage to quell the fire and preserve unity. In early 1531, the third, final, and decisive expedition sailed south. This time, Pizarro had about 180 men and 27 horses. This was a negligible force for conquering an empire with a population estimated at 6 to 12 million people. But fate gave him the greatest gift he could not have dreamed of. The empire he was about to conquer was devouring itself from within. Tawantinsuyu, the Inca Empire, had reached the peak of its power by the time the Spaniards arrived. It stretched for thousands of kilometers along the Andes, from modern-day Colombia to central Chile. It was not just a territory, but a complexly organized social and economic organism. Its skeleton was a grand network of paved roads, the Capacan, nearly 40,000 kilometers long, with suspension bridges over gorges and inns for messengers and armies. The Incas did not know the wheel or classical writing, but they created a knotted cord accounting system, the quipu, which allowed for complex statistical records of population, harvests, and tribute. All life in the empire was regulated by a system of labor tribute, the mita, by which every subject was obliged to work a certain amount of time for the state, in construction, in the army, or in the fields. But this gigantic structure rested on one linchpin, the absolute divine power of the Sapa Inca, the one and only Inca, the son of the sun. Around 1527, the great Inca Huayna Capac, while in the north of his empire in Quito, suddenly died. But he did not die of old age. He and his appointed heir, Ninan Cuyochi, fell victim to a new, terrible disease that was advancing ahead of the Spaniards, spreading along trade routes from the north. It was smallpox. The disease brought by Europeans to the New World was mowing down the Indians who had no immunity to it by the millions. Huayna Capac's death from smallpox became the prologue to a catastrophe. Dying, Huayna Capac made a fatal mistake. He divided the empire between two of his sons. To his legitimate heir, Huáscar, born of his legitimate wife's sister, he left the southern part of the empire with the capital in Cusco. And to his favorite son by a concubine from Quito, Atahualpa, he gave the northern territories. This decision violated centuries of tradition and immediately led to conflict. Atahualpa was an experienced and cruel military commander, the favorite of the army, that had fought alongside his father in the north. Huáscar was the legitimate ruler in the sacred city of Cusco, but he possessed neither the charisma nor the military talent of his brother. The inevitable war for sole power erupted with incredible brutality. It was not just a dynastic quarrel, but a clash of two worlds within one empire. The old priestly aristocracy of Cusco, which supported Huáscar, and the new battle-hardened military elite of the north, loyal to Atahualpa. This war, which lasted for several years, split the empire, exhausted its resources, and created an atmosphere of hatred and fear. It was in the midst of this fratricidal war that Francisco Pizarro and his tiny detachment landed on the coast of Ecuador. He moved through lands devastated by war and epidemic. He saw ruined villages and mountains of corpses. He heard stories of a great battle that was just then taking place in the mountains, and he realized that this chaos was his main ally. By the time Pizarro began his famous ascent into the Andes, the war between the brothers was already over. Atahualpa's generals, Quizquiz and Chalcuchimac, had defeated Huáscar's army in a decisive battle and taken him prisoner. Atahualpa had become the sole ruler of the empire. He was at that very moment with his huge 80,000-strong victorious army in the mountain resort town of Cajamarca, celebrating his victory and deciding the fate of his captured brother. It was at this moment that he received news that a handful of strange, bearded men, riding huge sheep-like animals, had come out of the sea and were moving towards him. Atahualpa treated this news with curiosity but without any fear. What could 150 foreigners do to his invincible army? He allowed them to ascend unimpeded along the mountain roads leading to Cajamarca. He wanted to personally see these strange newcomers and their animals, and then either take them into his service or sacrifice them to the gods. This was his greatest mistake. He did not know whom he was dealing with. He judged them by his own standards. He could not imagine the level of cunning and treachery that was the norm for European politics and warfare. And Pizarro marched on. He led his men over dizzying mountain passes, along magnificent Inca roads hanging over abysses. Terror and doubt seized his soldiers. They saw endless mountains and understood that they were going into the very heart of enemy territory, from which there was no way back. But Pizarro was inexorable. He made speeches appealing to their honor, greed, and faith. He told them they were soldiers of Christ, bringing the light of the true faith to the savages. He told them of the untold treasures that awaited them, and they followed him as if mesmerized. On November 15th, 1532, after an exhausting multi-week journey, Francisco Pizarro's detachment entered Cajamarca. The city was empty. Atahualpa's huge army was camped on the slopes of the surrounding mountains. In the evening, Pizarro sent an embassy led by his brother Hernando and Captain Hernando de Soto to the Inca. Atahualpa received them coldly and arrogantly. Sitting surrounded by his wives and nobles, he barely looked at the Spaniards, demonstrating his divine indifference. Only the sight of the horses, which the Spaniards deliberately spurred into a gallop, made him flinch slightly. He promised that the next day he himself would come to Cajamarca to meet their leader. After the ambassadors left, he ordered the execution of several of his warriors who had shown fear at the sight of the horses. He could not tolerate even a shadow of weakness in the face of strangers. The Spaniards returned to their camp in terror. They saw the countless fires of the enemy camp and heard the noise of a huge army. One of the participants in the events wrote that there was much fear among them, and they did not sleep all night, thinking about what awaited them. But Francisco Pizarro was not afraid, or at least he did not show it. A plan had already matured in his head, a plan so audacious, so insane that it could only have been born in the mind of a man with nothing to lose. He decided to repeat Cortés's trick. He decided to capture the emperor. Dawn broke on November 16th, 1532. It was a day destined to become one of the darkest in the history of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Pizarro had not slept all night preparing his trap. The plan was simple and monstrous. He hid his few soldiers in 3 large buildings facing the main square of Cajamarca. The cavalry, his main trump card, he divided into 2 detachments under the command of his brother Hernando and Hernando de Soto. The small artillery, consisting of a few falconets, he placed in the fortress overlooking the square. He himself, with 20 elite infantrymen, lay in wait in one of the buildings to personally lead the attack on the Inca's litter. The signal for the attack was to be the shot of an arquebus and the battle cry, "Santiago!" The whole day passed in agonizing anticipation. Atahualpa was in no hurry. Only in the evening did his procession slowly move towards the city. But then a new blow struck the Spaniards. A messenger from the Inca reported that Atahualpa and his warriors would come without weapons, as a sign of peace, and that they intended to spend the night in the square and meet with Pizarro the next day. This ruined the entire plan. An attack on unarmed people would be not just a massacre, but an indelible disgrace. Pizarro sent a return messenger begging the Inca to come to him for dinner before nightfall, promising him the most cordial reception. Atahualpa, showing fatal carelessness, agreed. He left his main army outside the city walls and, accompanied by 5,000 or 6,000 lightly armed servants and courtiers, entered the square. The procession was dazzling. The Inca sat on a golden throne, set on a litter decorated with parrot feathers and plates of gold and silver. His courtiers chanted monotonous hymns. Entering the square, Atahualpa was surprised to find it empty. He asked where the bearded men were, and at that moment the Dominican friar Vicente de Valverde emerged from one of the buildings accompanied by an interpreter. He held a cross in one hand and a Bible in the other. Approaching the litter, he began to read to Atahualpa the so-called requerimiento, a standard legal document that the Spaniards were required to read to the Indians before commencing hostilities. It briefly outlined the history of the world's creation, spoke of the authority of the Pope and the Spanish king, and offered the Indians to immediately accept Christianity and recognize themselves as vassals of Charles V. Otherwise, the Spaniards absolved themselves of all responsibility for the ensuing bloodshed. For Atahualpa, who considered himself a god in the center of the universe, this speech was a collection of incomprehensible and insulting sounds. Through an interpreter, he asked by what authority the friar was saying all this. Valverde pointed to the Bible. Atahualpa took the book, held it to his ear, listened, and hearing nothing, threw it to the ground with contempt. For Valverde, this was a terrible sacrilege. In a rage, he ran back to Pizarro, shouting for the Christians to come out and attack these dogs who rejected the word of God. He exclaimed that the tyrant had thrown the book of holy law to the ground, that the field brooked no delay, and that he absolved them of all their sins. This was the signal. Pizarro gave the sign, a shot from an arquebus rang out, trumpets blared, and from all sides with the battle cry, "Santiago!" The Spaniards rushed at the unarmed, stunned crowd of Incas. The effect was horrifying. The steel-clad infantrymen hacked and stabbed left and right. The cavalrymen, whose existence the Incas had not even suspected, crashed into the dense crowd, trampling people under their horses' hooves and lopping off heads with their long swords. The roar of the falconets, the flashes of arquebus shots, the barking of war dogs, the clang of steel, and the death cries of thousands of people merged into a hellish cacophony. The square turned into a slaughterhouse. The Incas, having no weapons and no way to retreat, ran about in panic, trampling each other. Their courtiers, showing incredible loyalty, shielded the Incas' litter with their bodies, exposing themselves to swords and spears, and when their hands were cut off, they tried to hold the litter up with their shoulders. Pizarro and his detachment fought their way to the litter. He personally seized Atahualpa by his clothes and in the scuffle was even slightly wounded in the hand by one of his own soldiers. Finally, the litter fell. The living god, the son of the sun, was on the ground in the hands of the bearded foreigners. As soon as the Inca was captured, his warriors, losing their will to resist, fled. The massacre continued until sunset. In 2 hours, according to various estimates, from 2,000 to 7,000 Incas were killed. The Spaniards had not a single man killed. A few, including Pizarro himself, received minor wounds. The empire was decapitated. 168 men, thanks to a combination of technological superiority, tactical surprise, incredible audacity, and the fatal carelessness of their opponent, had accomplished what had seemed impossible. That evening, Francisco Pizarro dined at the same table with his prisoner, the living god who, just that morning, had ruled over millions. The capture of Atahualpa paralyzed the empire. For the Incas, accustomed to the absolute divine authority of their ruler, his capture was a cosmological catastrophe. No one dared to take any action without his order. The huge army stationed near Cajamarca made no attempt to rescue their sovereign and dispersed in confusion. Pizarro understood perfectly well what a trump card he now held. Atahualpa was his hostage and his shield. Atahualpa himself, in captivity, quickly assessed the situation. He was an intelligent and perceptive man. He noticed one all-consuming passion that drove his captors, the thirst for gold, and he decided he could buy his freedom. He made Pizarro an offer that stunned the imagination not only of the conquistadors but of all of Europe. In exchange for his life and freedom, he promised to fill the room in which he was held, measuring about 6.7 by 5.2 meters, once with gold up to a mark at the height of a raised hand, and the adjacent smaller room twice with silver. And all this within 2 months. For Pizarro and his men, this was an offer they couldn't refuse. An official notarial act was drawn up, and from all corners of the vast empire, caravans of llamas and porters began to stream into Cajamarca. They carried gold and silver vessels, jewelry, statues, and plates that had lined the walls of temples. The conquistadors greedily watched as the room slowly filled with treasures. This was the legendary El Dorado become reality. While the ransom was being collected, Atahualpa lived in relative comfort. His wives and servants were allowed to attend him. He learned to play chess, observing Spanish customs with interest. A strange, almost friendly relationship developed between him and Pizarro. The illiterate conquistador perhaps felt a certain respect for his royal captive. But while gold flowed into Cajamarca, the situation was changing. Firstly, Diego de Almagro arrived from Panama with a reinforcement of 150 men, long overdue. Almagro's men, who had not participated in the massacre and the Inca's capture, looked at the treasures with envy and demanded their share. This increased the tension between the two detachments. Secondly, the Spaniards began to worry. Rumors spread that Atahualpa's generals were gathering huge armies and preparing to attack Cajamarca. But the main event that sealed the Inca's fate was the news that he himself ironically brought to Pizarro. By his secret order, his captured brother Huáscar had been drowned in a river. Atahualpa had eliminated the last legitimate claimant to the throne. But by doing so, he deprived the Spaniards of the possibility of using Huáscar as a puppet. And most importantly, he showed them that even from captivity he was capable of giving deadly orders. In the eyes of many conquistadors, he became even more dangerous. By the summer of 1533, the ransom had been almost completely collected. The treasures were incredible. For the conquistadors, these items were merely weight in metal. 9 forges worked day and night, turning unique works of art accumulated over centuries into faceless ingots. Statues of gods, ritual vessels, the finest jewelry depicting animals and plants with astonishing realism. All of it vanished irrevocably into the melting furnaces. This was not just a division of spoils. It was an act of cultural vandalism of epic proportions. In the end, it amounted to over 6 tons of gold and nearly 12 tons of silver. It was the largest amount of precious metals ever obtained by Europeans in a single battle. After deducting the royal fifth and other payments, each cavalryman who participated in Atahualpa's capture received about 40 kilograms of gold and 80 kilograms of silver. The infantrymen received half as much. Pizarro himself received a share 7 times that of a cavalryman, not counting Atahualpa's golden throne. Overnight, these ragged men became some of the richest people in the world. The ransom was paid. But Atahualpa did not receive his freedom. To release him was too dangerous. He could lead a rebellion and destroy them all. Almagro and his men, who had received only a negligible part of the ransom, were the loudest in demanding the Inca's death. They wanted to move on as quickly as possible to the capital, Cusco, where, according to rumors, there were even more treasures. A mock trial was held. Atahualpa was accused of 12 crimes, usurping power and murdering his brother Huáscar, idolatry, polygamy, embezzling state funds, that is, the collected ransom, and most importantly, preparing a rebellion against the Spaniards. A key role in the trial was played by the interpreter Felipilo, who, according to some reports, due to personal enmity and a desire to get close to one of Atahualpa's wives, deliberately distorted his answers and incited the Spaniards to pass a death sentence. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Atahualpa was sentenced to be burned at the stake as a pagan. For an Inca who believed that the preservation of the body was necessary for the afterlife, this was the most terrible sentence. At the last moment, he agreed to be baptized. Friar Valverde baptized him under the name Francisco. In return, the execution was commuted. On the evening of July 26th, 1533, in the main square of Cajamarca, where he had been captured 9 months earlier, the last independent ruler of the Inca Empire, Atahualpa, was strangled with a garrote. The murder of Atahualpa, despite the paid ransom, became one of the most shameful acts in the entire history of the conquest. It drew condemnation even in Spain. Emperor Charles V himself, it is said, was displeased with this treacherous act. But the deed was done. The way to Cusco, the heart of the empire, was open. Having beheaded the empire, Pizarro now had to capture its body. His goal was Cusco, the sacred capital, which the Incas considered the navel of the earth. But to march on Cusco without some semblance of legitimacy was dangerous. So Pizarro resorted to the tried and true method of colonizers. He found a puppet. It was one of Huáscar's younger brothers, Tupac Hualpa. He was solemnly crowned as the new Sapa Inca, and in his name the Spaniards set out. The march to Cusco was no easy stroll. Atahualpa's generals, especially the mighty Quizquiz, were not going to give up. They set ambushes, destroyed bridges, and attacked the Spaniards in narrow mountain gorges. Several fierce battles took place in which the Spaniards, thanks to their cavalry and steel weapons, were victorious but suffered losses. During this march, the puppet Inca Tupac Hualpa also died, most likely poisoned by one of Atahualpa's generals. But again, the internal division within the empire helped the Spaniards. Many tribes conquered by the Incas hated their rulers and saw the Spaniards as liberators. The aristocracy of Cusco, belonging to Huáscar's clan, also hated Atahualpa and his northern generals. A young prince from Huáscar's line named Manco Inca Yupanqui came out to meet Pizarro. He offered the Spaniards his alliance in the fight against Atahualpa's generals. Pizarro gladly accepted. He had a new, this time much more influential and legitimate puppet Inca. On November 15th, 1533, exactly 1 year after the massacre in Cajamarca, Francisco Pizarro and his conquistadors, along with their new ally, Manco Inca, triumphantly entered Cusco. What they saw surpassed all their expectations. Cusco was a magnificent city of skillfully fitted stone blocks. But the main thing was its treasures. If Atahualpa's ransom had seemed immense to them, the wealth of Cusco was simply unimaginable. A plunder began, one of the largest in world history. The Spaniards tore the gold plates from the walls of the Coricancha, the Temple of the Sun, pried out golden cornices and dug up life-sized gold statues from burials. They found a golden garden with figures of llamas, shepherds, flowers, and butterflies made of pure gold and silver. They burst into the palaces and tombs of mummified rulers, taking everything that glittered. The greatest works of art, created over centuries, were mercilessly melted down into standard ingots. The booty seized in Cusco was even greater than Atahualpa's ransom. After the plundering of the capital, it was necessary to organize the governance of the new colony. Pizarro officially crowned Manco Inca as Sapa Inca, but real power, of course, remained in Spanish hands. They divided among themselves the lands, palaces, and thousands of Indians as slaves under the encomienda system. But Pizarro, as a far-sighted administrator, understood that Cusco, located high in the mountains, could not be the capital of the Spanish colony. He needed a capital on the coast, connected to Panama and Spain. On January 18th, 1535, on the banks of the Rimac River, he personally founded a new capital, which he named Ciudad de los Reyes, or City of the Kings. It was so named in honor of the three Magi, as the decision to found it was made on the day of the Epiphany. Later, this name was replaced by a distorted Indian name for the river, Lima. This city, built by him from scratch, became his beloved creation and the main center of Spanish power in South America for many centuries. It seemed Pizarro had achieved everything. He was the governor of a vast country, the owner of immense wealth, the founder of cities. He had risen as high as he could have ever dreamed. But it was at this moment of triumph that the shadow of old betrayal and new envy fell upon his conquest. The snake he himself had spawned by signing the Capitulation of Toledo was preparing to strike. The seeds of conflict between Pizarro and Almagro, sown in Toledo, bore bloody fruit on the fertile soil of Peruvian treasures. Almagro never forgave his partner for the humiliating terms of the capitulation. Although Pizarro tried to make amends, their relationship was poisoned with distrust. In 1534, a royal decree arrived from Spain that was supposed to settle the conflict, but in fact only exacerbated it. The new lands were divided into two governorships. The northern part, New Castile, went to Francisco Pizarro. The southern part, New Toledo, was given to Diego de Almagro. But the problem was that the borders were vaguely defined by latitudes, and the main prize, the richest city of Cusco, was right on the border between the two governorships. Both leaders considered it theirs. To defuse the situation for a time, Pizarro persuaded Almagro to go and conquer the lands further south, the territories of modern-day Chile, which were rumored to be no less rich than Peru. In 1535, Almagro, having gathered a large detachment of 500 Spaniards and thousands of Indian allies, set out on his fateful expedition. This expedition turned into a disaster for him. Instead of gold, he found only the sun-scorched Atacama Desert, and then the icy passes of the Andes, where his men and thousands of their Indian allies, accustomed to a warmer climate, froze to death by the hundreds. Horses sank into deep snow, provisions ran out, and the local Araucanian tribes, unlike the Incas, had no centralized state and offered fierce guerrilla resistance. Having lost many men and found no treasures, the embittered, deceived Almagro turned back in 1537, and he returned at the most dramatic moment. While he was away, the young Inca Manco, realizing he was just a puppet in the hands of cruel conquerors, had fled from Cusco and raised a great rebellion. Hundreds of thousands of Indian warriors besieged Cusco, where the Pizarro brothers, Hernando and Gonzalo, were trapped with a small garrison. Another Inca army besieged Lima. For a time, it seemed that Spanish rule was at an end. The Pizarro brothers, showing miracles of bravery, desperately defended Cusco. In one of the sorties, the youngest and most beloved of the brothers, Juan Pizarro, was killed. It was at this moment that Almagro's battered but battle-hardened army approached Cusco. He found himself between two fires, the Incas and Pizarro's garrison. He could have helped his countrymen, but resentment and the thirst for power prevailed. He declared that Cusco rightfully belonged to him. At night, he burst into the city, defeated the remnants of the garrison, and arrested the Pizarro brothers, Hernando and Gonzalo. Then he defeated the Inca army, lifting the siege. Almagro had become the master of Cusco. Thus began the first civil war between the conquistadors. It was an ugly, fratricidal war of conquerors on foreign soil. Francisco Pizarro, who was in Lima, tried to negotiate, but it was too late. After several months of humiliating captivity, Hernando Pizarro was released under a sworn promise to leave Peru. But as soon as he was free, he, with the blessing of his brother Francisco, assembled an army and marched on Cusco. On April 26, 1538, the two armies of conquistadors met in a decisive battle at Las Salinas on the salt flats near Cusco. Pizarro's army was commanded by Hernando, Almagro's by his loyal captain Rodrigo Ordóñez. Old Almagro himself, sick and feeble, watched the battle from a hill. The battle was fierce. The outcome was decided by arquebuses with new incendiary bullets used by Pizarro's men. Ordóñez was killed and Almagro's army was shattered. The victors showed no mercy. A massacre began. Diego de Almagro himself, who was nearly 70, was taken prisoner. Hernando Pizarro, remembering his humiliation, put him on trial and, despite pleas for mercy, sentenced his old enemy to death. On July 8, 1538, Diego de Almagro, one of the madmen who had started this enterprise, was strangled with a garrote in his prison cell, and then his body was publicly beheaded in the main square of Cusco. Francisco Pizarro, who arrived in Cusco shortly thereafter, approved the execution of his former partner. Now he was the sole and absolute ruler of Peru. He stood at the pinnacle of the world, having eliminated all his enemies, both Inca and Spanish. But the blood of his old comrade cried out for vengeance. The victory at Las Salinas was the beginning of his own end. The last 3 years of Francisco Pizarro's life were the peak of his power. He was a marquis, the ruler of a vast territory, one of the richest men in the world. He governed his new colony from the capital he had founded, Lima. He built palaces and churches, distributed land to his supporters, and sent expeditions to unexplored corners of the continent, one of which, under the leadership of his brother Gonzalo and Francisco de Orellana, would accidentally discover the Amazon River. He was a living legend. But beneath this brilliant surface, a conspiracy was brewing. The supporters of the executed Almagro, deprived of land and honors, had gathered into a poor and embittered group in Lima. They were called the Men of Chile. Their leader was Almagro's young son, also named Diego, nicknamed El Mozo, or the Lad. They lived in poverty, sharing a single cloak among them, and their hearts burned with a thirst for revenge. Pizarro, who was now over 60, seemed to have lost his former caution. He despised the conspirators, calling them a bunch of ragged beggars, and took no precautions. He was warned of the danger, but he just waved it off. And so on Sunday, June 26th, 1541, vengeance caught up with him. About a dozen conspirators, led by Juan de Rada, burst into the governor's palace in Lima during dinner. Their cry of "Death to the tyrant" echoed through the halls. Most of Pizarro's guests fled in panic, jumping out of windows. Only his half-brother Francisco Martín de Alcántara and a few loyal servants remained with the old conquistador. But Pizarro would not have been Pizarro if he had surrendered without a fight. Without even having time to put on his cuirass, he grabbed his sword and rushed to meet the assassins. A desperate fight ensued. The old lion, who was nearly 70, fought with the fury of a young warrior. He killed one of the attackers, but the odds were too uneven. His brother and servants fell. Finally, one of the conspirators struck him in the throat. Pizarro fell. Dying, he, according to tradition, dipped his finger in his own blood, drew a cross on the floor, kissed it, and breathed his last. Thus died Francisco Pizarro, the illegitimate swineherd from Extremadura, the conqueror of the Inca Empire. His body was hastily buried in the backyard of the cathedral under construction. His death did not bring peace to Peru. It was merely the prologue to a new, even bloodier civil war that would plague the country for many more years. What is his legacy? For some, he is a great hero, a model of unbending will and courage, a man who, by the strength of his spirit, overcame all obstacles and gave Spain an entire empire. For others, he is a bloody tyrant, a treacherous murderer, the destroyer of a great civilization whose name has become synonymous with cruelty and greed. The truth, as always, is more complex. He was a man of his time, a cruel and uncompromising one. He was a product of Extremadura and the school of survival in the New World. He cannot be judged by the standards of our time, but one cannot deny the monstrosity of his deeds. The conquest of Peru was at once one of the greatest feats of human perseverance and one of the most tragic and shameful pages in history. Francisco Pizarro did not seek knowledge. He was not an explorer like Columbus or a politician like Cortés. He sought only gold and power. And he found them. But the price that an entire civilization paid for it was incalculable. And in the end, this same insatiable thirst for power and gold destroyed him and almost all his comrades, turning the greatest triumph into a bloody tragedy whose echo is still heard today. Thank you for your attention. If you found this story interesting and want to continue delving into the most exciting and dramatic pages of the past, please subscribe to our channel, leave your comments, and share this video. Many more amazing journeys through time await us.